Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, non-stops were in the news this week, both to describe the politicking in the gubernatorial campaign and the jets taking off from the new airport. It was the candidates who seemed to be making the most noise. Elsewhere, there was an investigation into faked highway accidents and a deadline passed for the clergy abuse lawsuits. We'll be discussing these stories as well as a controversy over a local businessman's cause of death and new ownership for the state's largest bank. At the gate for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Stephanie Grace, columnist, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4, and Ramon Antonio Vargas, reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. Stephanie, we go over to you first. Just a week left now, really the home stretch for the governor's race. How we're looking?
And over for a lot of people because we really are seeing some very strong early voting numbers. We're 1 week away from this runoff. Governor John Bel Edwards against Eddie Rispone, the Republican businessman. There's a lot going on. I don't think there's a lot that's really changing, I have to say. I think this is, the storyline of this campaign has been really set from the beginning, and it's very much John Bel Edwards, well-liked, strong approval ratings, low disapproval ratings, but he's a Democrat in a Republican state. Eddie Rispone, the Republican, Trump, trial lawyers, all the kind of code words, not a lot of substance. Many people have pointed that out. John Bel Edwards certainly has pointed that out. Does it matter? How are people going to vote? Are they going to vote on the person or the party? That's the question. Turnout, I think, is really the big focus at this point. There were some areas, John Bel Edwards, Democratic voters didn't turn out as in numbers as high as he needs them in the primary, so there's a real focus on that. There's been a lot of focus on black voters in New Orleans. LaToya Cantrell is helping him. There's going to be a rally, an election eve rally with Trombone Shorty. And there's also focus on the north part of the state, and we saw a lot of campaigning there this week, very high level. Donald Trump came to Monroe. Now,
that would have been Abraham's district.
Exactly, and that's the point. Yeah. So the biggest pot of voters that are probably in play are those Abraham voters, those people who voted for the other Republican in the race, Ralph Abraham, the congressman from the Monroe area. And of course, the presumption is a lot of those Republican voters will go to the other Republican, but not all of them. So, how many of them are voting for their hometown guy? How many of them are angry that Eddie Rispone really attacked Abraham in ways that many people considered unfair?
But doing the electoral math here, John Bel was at 47% in the primary,
so he
doesn't need to peel off, that much of a percentage of the Abraham or the undecided.
Correct, especially if he gets that, core Democratic vote up higher.
Right, and you do have to assume that the 47% who did cast the ballot for him the first time around, they're not going to be switching over to Rispone.
No, and they'll probably show up. Because if it was important back then, a lot of people thought he might win in the first. So now it's really do or die for him.
And clearly he's hoping for whoever voted for him the first time around, and then some people who might have taken it for granted or stayed home.
And maybe he's partly to blame for that somewhat, because the message, he says now that he didn't expect to win in the first, but the message was that he was pretty far ahead and that he could have. So I think there wasn't a sense of urgency among some voters that there might be now, especially. And that's really why you see him focus on Medicaid expansion. That's a really big issue. Eddie Rispone is not against Medicaid expansion. He doesn't say he's going to end it, but he says he'll freeze it. What that means is very confusing, and it's scary to people, I think.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One, John Bel Edwards is no longer the only Democrat among Southern governors with that election in Kentucky,
which was so
during
interesting
the week.
Because they did what the incumbent Matt Bevin, he's almost like Jindal in the second term. He's a Republican in a Republican state who did very Republican things, went after teacher unions, went after pensions. Very, very unpopular, like Bobby Jindal in that end there.
And that may be the factor more than any kind of politics.
So Trump came in and could not get him over the top.
The other thing that occurs to me, that two ways that politics or elections have changed, let's say over the last 20 years. One is we're talking about the importance of the black vote, which is always important, but I don't think that vote's as easy to get out as it used to be because you don't have those kind of organizations you did, like the Soul and the Bowl.
So strong. When I started off 20, 25 years ago, I mean, I remember going out on Election Day and seeing the Mark Morial when he was mayor. Progressive Democrats, Bill Jefferson when he was in Congress. These were the giants in New Orleans, and they're, Progressive Democrats is gone. Life is a shadow of what it was. It's more fluid now.
You could go along Claiborne Avenue and still see Progressive Democrat signs.
And you could just go and collect. I used to do it. I used to go to Elysian Fields. There were certain intersections where I go and collect ballots on Election Day, and you don't see.
But the other factor, I think, is early voting, because there used to be what they call absentee voting.
Yeah.
And absentee voting was something that the state allowed sort of reluctantly. Like, if you need to do it, go and do it.
And you had to say that you couldn't go
But
on
it wasn't
Election
really
Day.
encouraged. It was just there as a service. Now they're encouraged with what they call early voting.
And people really like doing it.
People do like doing it. We've seen really high numbers this go around.
But what that means, though, is that the way it's going is that vote total is piling up. It's really because absentee voting never really amounted to that much. Okay, early voting is, and so that's going to be part of the strategies. And so people that used to say, "Well, we're going to save our grand finale for the campaign to the last week," now it's really kind of ending the last month or so.
I mean, you heard
because
Donald
of the
Trump
impact.
talk about it at the Monroe rally. He kept looking around and saying, "Can you believe I'm here for early voting?" But that's what we do now. We early vote, and it does mean if there's something that comes up at the end, then a lot of people
will have already cast their vote.
I keep thinking, remember former Councilman Mike Early? Well, how great that would have been for him to have signs all over town saying "Vote early."
There we go.
One more point, because we have to move on to the next segment. Trump is coming back.
He's coming back on Thursday to Shreveport, again, North Louisiana, not Abraham's district, but adjacent. So where they tend to deploy him for these local races that happen in Kentucky, Mississippi, is not necessarily the urban areas, but the rural areas, because that's where he's very strong. Urban areas and even suburban areas are shifting back towards Democrats, but that Republican vote is out there in these kind of smaller places.
So when is
and also he's going to the LSU Alabama game,
that's
which
right.
is in
He'll be there.
Alabama.
And then Trump goes to Shreveport? What, next
Shreveport
Thursday?
on Thursday.
2 days before the vote, and early voting ends Saturday. Tomorrow. Look it up. All right, thanks a lot, Steph. Mike, over to you. You had a couple of reports about faked traffic accidents, and the feds are looking into this now because there was a group of people that seem to be involved in a whole lot of accidents that they are suspicious about.
Well, the feds are not only looking into it, they've dropped an indictment of 5 people. It lays out what we call staged accident, in which somebody intentionally rams into an 18-wheeler, then claims that it was the 18-wheeler's fault. Now, those big trucks with a cab and a long trailer, if there's a collision in the trailer, the truck driver doesn't always feel any impact at all. Sometimes there's no damage. So it can be difficult to figure out. Officers arrive at the scene. Now, in the staged accident caused by the people in a car, there's often a staged witness. So somebody who is conveniently there to say, "Oh, that truck ran into that car." And in this particular case that's now under indictment with 5 people, there was a so-called witness who was pegged as the ringleader, the organizer, and his name is Damien LeBeau. He had himself been a plaintiff in 5 previous accident lawsuits, and that is one of the clues that helped defense attorneys eventually sort of crack the code as to what was going on. It's always been suspected that there's an element of fraud in some of these lawsuits and insurance claims, but to actually pin down the accidents that are bogus is extremely difficult. But a lot of things are turning the tide. Number one, the trucking community, the industry is getting to be savvy and finding out ways to protect itself, starting with cameras mounted on the trucks. We were able to show in part 1 of the 3-part series an accident clearly staged, caught on camera. The virtue of that video footage, and those plaintiffs filed a lawsuit, and oftentimes they don't file right away. You have up to a year to file. They waited a year, filed, and at that point the trucking company went scrambling, found the video. Upon presenting that, the attorneys for the plaintiffs dropped out of the case. The people who said they were hurt so bad they had to go see doctors, they dropped out of the case. And so that camera was able to save upwards of $600,000 or so. Turns out that Damien LeBeau was involved in that accident that was caught on video. Now he's indicted in an accident that was 6 days earlier. Now, the thing that is most intriguing, and this is where the feds are going with this in a much more expansive investigation, is that the orchestrator of this stage accident, allegedly, was on the phone with the attorney who ended up filing the lawsuit. Not after, but before the actual accident.
Just minutes before. Mm-hmm.
He was on the phone an hour before and a half hour before, and then on the phone directly afterward. And according to the indictment, the attorney met with Damien LeBeau, paid him $7,500. And in our story, we were able to connect the dots and name the attorney, Daniel Patrick Keating, who's a local attorney who's handled many of these types of cases, as have other plaintiffs' attorneys. This scam seems to be centered in the New Orleans area, and some of the same names of both the plaintiffs who pop up in lawsuit after lawsuit, as well as the attorneys who are representing them, are under heavy scrutiny by federal authorities. The other fact that we know is that 8 of those lawsuits that are pending and working their way to trial have actually been halted by federal judges due to, quote, ongoing criminal investigation. A clear signal that this is much broader than this single accident in this single indictment.
So the method here was, because you found also the same people oftentimes making these claims, filing these lawsuits, oftentimes like in the same area, the same type of accident, and then ultimately they would be settled, wouldn't go to court, because the trucking companies, the insurance companies just didn't want to take the time and the expense, and they just settle.
Well, a couple of factors there, and that was, one of the things that the benefit of being a reporter, pulling this whole sort of universe of cases, I'm able to see that so many of these lawsuits were occurring in the same stretch of I-10, for example. There was another spot of near a truck stop on Old Gentilly Road where there were more than a dozen almost identical accidents in a very short period of time. But if a defense attorney is hired by a particular trucking company, he might not be talking to some other defense attorney for some different trucking company. So they don't know to compare and trade notes and see those similarities, which I was able to see, number one. Secondly, a defense attorney might think that they're dealing with a fraud, either a staged accident, which is intentionally colliding into a truck, or a phantom accident, which is there was really no contact at all, but the people in the car said there was, and they have these pains of whiplash or soft tissue injury. But the thing that really tied it all together ultimately was when defense attorneys were able to convince the insurance companies, this is fraud. Let's go ahead and spend the money so that we can put a stop to these kind of cases once and for all. The insurance company, it's more expensive to fight these lawsuits and drag it out to trial.
Is this one of the reasons our car insurance rates are so high?
It is, in fact, according to Jim Donnelly, our state insurance commissioner, $600 per year that all of us pay in our regular car insurance for fraud alone. So the hope is, and these are cases, there's been some in Baton Rouge, but the lion's share of these questioned cases is in New Orleans. And if there's a, put a stop to that, which involves not just the people willing to stage the accident, but the attorneys who are somewhat enablers.
And so
most on interstates?
Almost all on the interstate or near truck stops.
Right, okay, and so the feds are just starting to look here, and they're really digging deeper
We have
into
8 cases that have been halted due to the criminal investigation, so we know it's at least that. The estimate is that it's probably closer to 36 accident cases that are under scrutiny.
We'll be looking for that. Thanks a lot, Mike. Airport is open, Errol. Actually, it's the same airport. It's a new terminal.
Well, yeah, a new location on the same space where all the things called WYES have been within that area. Just a couple of other thoughts is that You know, in modern American cities, they say that the two modern buildings that you judge a city by is its stadium and its airport. And they're always expected to have modern and being updated. Well, New Orleans sort of has like an ultimate stadium. It's not modern, but it certainly passes the test. And so as an advanced stadium, and now having an airport. So I guess within that chemistry of what a city should be. And of course, when you rely on tourism, you want that. But the other thing that comes to mind really quickly is I remember a few years ago when Denver opened its new airport, Stapleton, which is supposed to be the ultimate modern airport, and they even built like replicas of teepees outside, and looked like the Rocky Mountains, everything. It was supposed to be the ultimate airport, and they developed this underground railroad system of moving luggage, and it didn't work, and that went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so sometimes for all the fanfare, you're going to have some of these problems at the beginning, which I think we're experiencing. But I know Stephanie's been there and kind of inspected the place.
It's beautiful. It's light and airy, and you feel like you're in a different city almost. A city that has new things, not old things. You walk in, if you come from short-term parking, that's the way I came up. You go up to the 4th floor, walk in to the 3rd floor. It's where people can check in, and then you go down escalators. There's one giant TSA checkpoint. You don't go to different checkpoints depending on which concourse. And then once you're through, you can go anywhere. You can go, which is appealing to people because there are all these restaurants, including some famous names from New Orleans where that are supposed to be very big draws. I didn't get to try any of them. I was there the day before it opened. But other new amenities, there's a charging station on every other seat. There is Wi-Fi that worked, I can tell you, because I used it. Mitch Landrieu, it really is his baby. It's opening on LaToya Cantrell's watch, but Mitch Landrieu is really the driving force behind this.
He wanted to be in office, but it was delayed.
It was delayed. It would have hit right at when he left office, but he was there. He was flying out that day. He flew out from the old airport and arrived back at the new airport. He told me the week before, because he knows Marcia will understand this, he said there are a lot of women's bathrooms. And
Much
there
appreciated.
Are. Yes,
Thanks,
much
Mitch.
appreciated. And even a pet relief area. So it's very modern. There's music. There's a stage down on the 1st floor, and you can hear the music from everywhere. It's exciting.
So there's some traffic problems encountered, and they're trying to make adjustments for that and making a turn lane.
DOT is out there around the clock, and they're adjusting, painting lanes and deciding. When you get off Loyola, you have to go through a couple of lights, and then you're there. So and eventually there will be the flyover lane, but it's the flyover ramp, but that's a couple years away.
We're hearing about all these great restaurants, but people don't have access to those unless they're flying and they've gone through security.
Most of them, yes.
You can't just walk in and say, I want to go
Unless you want to buy a ticket.
For people who are flying, really,
For the most part, to access
For
those
modern
restaurants.
amenities, though, the one thing that we did hear constant complaints about Uber and Lyft, rideshare.
They're having some issues, apparently, but it's confusing, I have to say, because there are a lot of, you have to be in this lane or that lane, and people will get used to it. You can't get there from Airline Highway anymore. When I was
you can
driving
take the access road from Airline
you can
to
take
get
the
to
access,
Veterans,
Yes, but you could also take the old access road to get to Airline if you're going to rental car, the old parking garage, which will be
okay.
the
But
shuttles.
one other thing to note, some baggage claims too, baggage problems from people are not getting their baggage when they reach their destination.
They
so
say
that's
the
another thing
contractors are out there working on it, and it's inevitable when you're bringing in a new system. Hopefully it'll all be taken care of
After
before Thanksgiving.
after all of these decades of talking about, new airport, which for a while was actually a whole new place, but now we do have the new terminal. All right, thanks a lot, Steph. Okay, Ramon, over to you. It was the year deadline. It was a year ago. It's hard to believe. It's been a year ago already since the Archdiocese released the list of credible claims against priests, against clergy. So the lawsuit deadline was for a year. That deadline is now passed, come and gone.
So it's one specific type of claim, and it would have been the one that if news of the list of priests who had been, that was released, of priests who had been credibly accused of sexual molestation of minors, and that jogged your memory, then from that point you had 1 year, a 1 year statute of limitations that you had to get in under to sue. So the deadline spurred, in the days leading up to the deadline, several new lawsuits, mostly against people that were on that list, which suggests that there were people who saw the name of their alleged abuser, and then went ahead and began the process to pursue damages for the conduct perpetrated on them. That said, so there were some people that picked up the paper the next day, or that saw, obviously that generated a ton of news coverage, and that's continuing. And so there's any number of entry points to if you see a story on that topic a couple of weeks later and that jogged your memory, so it's a year from there. So the lapse of the deadline doesn't necessarily mean
that there's
no more lawsuits coming. And the other thing that is important to note is that there are other arguments against the statute of limitations expiring that attorneys use. Repressed memory is one of them. It's had some success, but there are also, like, if the theory that if there was any sort of alleged cover-up, that would then either do away with statute of limitations completely or just reset the clock every time there's a step taken to kind of cover up any misconduct or identifying an alleged abuser. And so I think, and you've seen there are more lawsuits. I expect more to be filed in the coming days and for a while, until there's either a universal resolution to it, which may not happen, or each of these cases is somehow resolved.
So there are a lot of them working their way through the courts now, and some just being filed.
Yes, and there's an untold number that are being handled through a private mediation process, either with religious orders or with the archdiocese itself. So.
All righty, Ramon, thanks a lot. We're going to jump over quickly now to our next segment, banks. Errol, that's you. Louisiana's largest bank has merged now with a bank from Tennessee.
I'm going to end this with a question. With this merger, what is the new largest bank in Louisiana in terms of deposits? And I'll say that in a moment. But until this week, it has been Iberia Bank. And if you remember in New Orleans, you used to see these big towers, the Hibernia Bank and the Whitney Bank and First NBC. I mean, they just suggested hugeness and power, and none of them really exist as banks anymore. And it's been these smaller regional banks that developed. And Iberia Bank was a huge success story. It began in Lafayette, and Darrell Byrd and some former executives of First NBC bought into it in Lafayette, and they expanded it. And in an article in the Biz New Orleans website, they quoted Peter Raschuti pointing out that around 2005, as they were expanding, a lot of banks were moving into Florida, and that was when the recession hit. They moved into Arkansas, which didn't have the same impact, and so it was able to survive that. And so it really developed into a decent Southern bank. But it's I don't know if merger is quite the word. I don't know what the right word is. But there's certainly some combination with a bank called First Horizon, and it's out of Memphis. It is bigger than Iberia, not a lot bigger, but a little bit bigger. It is going to have the majority control on the board, like one or two votes. However, Darrell Byrd will be, in effect, the chairman of the board. And so it is more, and the banks will be changed to First Horizon. That'll be the name. So there's more. So you kind of, if you had to pick a winner out of this, you got to figure, well, I guess it's First Horizon. Yeah. And so they're going to merge, and it's going to be like one of the 25 largest banks in the country. And so that's pretty amazing. Which goes back to the question, with Iberia Bank no longer being a Louisiana bank, what is the largest bank in Louisiana? Origin Bank of Ruston.
Wow.
Really? No, we wouldn't have guessed that one there, although absolutely.
These old Louisiana names, though. Iberia Bank, Hibernia,
But this is the future, I think. I mean, you talk to banking people, and there's smaller banks merging and growing, and the number of banks altogether is just really diminished as you've had more and more mergers.
But Whitney kind of kept the name as part of Hancock Whitney.
At least they kept the name,
The name's alive.
It would probably have been more to New Orleans to call it Whitney Hancock than Hancock First, but that's an example of a Mississippi bank and a Louisiana bank coming together.
Right. Well, they had sort of a long connection, back to really the 19th century. Hancock Whitney did. So First Horizon headquarters is going to be in Memphis, the regional headquarters here in New Orleans.
They're going to have headquarters, and they're going to be expanding throughout the South, especially the Gulf South.
Okay. Thanks a lot, E. Ramona, back over to you. We heard this week the coroner, Mississippi County coroner, basically said regarding Roland Gronkowski's death that he had been ruled an accident by the sheriff, but not quite so.
So I guess the sheriff made very strong statements at the beginning that their investigation suggested, by all indications, it was a tragic hunting accident. The coroner this week, I guess, went public with his thoughts, and I sensed it might go this way because initially he was stopped well short of endorsing that theory that the sheriff had kind of very publicly put out in the media. that he said that if you take all the circumstances, that he was alone, that he just found unlikely that somehow a rifle would have discharged with it pointed in such close range to his chest, because the gunshot wound was described as contact. That suicide by no means could be ruled out, and if you were to ask his personal opinion, and his informed scientific opinion is that suicide may even be more likely. And obviously I'm very sensitive to how difficult of a topic it is, and especially for Mr. von Kornatowski's family. But it can have implications on. There are a lot of people who say that Mr. von Kornatowski that Roland von Kornatowski owed them money, and a lot of money, and in some cases defrauded them of money. And as they try to make themselves whole through the civil process, it can have implications if he has life insurance, and then if the life insurance policy won't pay out because it won't pay out because it's ruled a suicide. That could affect their ability to make it, and it's very speculative, because obviously if any life insurance policy, as we're told, if any life insurance policy has a beneficiary of his family, that may be beyond the reach of creditors. But if it's not, if it somehow ends up in his succession, which colloquially we refer to as his estate, then that could be something that creditors could get their hold on. The final call is going to belong to the state medical examiner. The system in Mississippi is not quite like it is here, where, say, the Jefferson Parish coroner would issue a final ruling in the manner of death. We know what the cause of death is, which is a gunshot wound, but the manner of death, whether it was an accident, whether it was a suicide, whether it was something else, that a lot of the times in Louisiana will fall to the parish coroner. Mississippi, it's a central office, state medical examiner. It is not uncommon for state medical examiner, from what the coroner told us, to leave some cases that are difficult undetermined. There's such a huge backlog because they're centralized. So it could be a while before we get an answer, if we ever do.
All right, Ramon, thanks a lot. It is time to look ahead.
Okay. Well, after the governor's election, the next big election is going to be the presidential primaries. And in Louisiana, it's going to be April 4th of next year. The Republican and the Democratic will be the same day. Democrat will be the most important because they have the most candidates and they're out of office. On that day, there will be a total of 3 state primaries. The other 2 are in Hawaii and Alaska. So ours will be the most important in continental United States.
Right.
Okay.
And the earliest to come in, I will say, for those who follow that. Next Saturday, or for early voting right now, there are 4 ballot questions for New Orleanians. One of them is kind of high profile. It's an increase in taxes on short-term rentals. This is part of the mayor's package that she negotiated when she went to the legislature earlier this year to fund sewage and water board and infrastructure.
All right, thanks. Mike.
We'll have to promote a upcoming Channel 4 special investigative report coming up next Friday by my colleague David Hammer, in which he apparently has solved the mystery of the smell from the Jefferson Parish landfill. He has solved. We got to wait for a week for that to come out.
All right, thanks, David.
People are going to be very interested in how he cracked the code.
All right, Ramon, real quick.
The trial of 2 men charged in the 2013 murder of an armored truck driver is on hold through the weekend, while there's a motion for mistrial pending. That'll be in the paper tomorrow.
All righty. Thanks a lot. Thanks, you guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. See you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.